the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you back. And I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I've been a professor of philosophy. I've been a real estate investor. I've even written books. And enough about me. Oh, I do want to say one more thing. By the time this show comes out or is distributed, my book, Tom Bombadil, may be just a few weeks away from actually appearing, on the platforms and on the websites of booksellers around the world. So just want you to know, I'm not sure what it's going to be called yet. I know the title I want for the book, In the House of Tom Bombadil, but I have a suspicion that the Tolkien estate will not approve of that title, because that is a title of a chapter in the Fellowship of the Ring. Anyway, little cul-de-sac there.
What's your next book going to be after that one, Chris?
Please, stop. Lynn, I promise.
I'll hold you to that.
That's right. It is the second book in my series, my young adult series. Anyway, so enough about
Look, my 12-year-old's growing. It needs to be finished before he's reached the adulthood.
Yeah. Has he read the first book?
I believe he has, if not, he will be very soon. But
okay.
Yeah, I believe he has. Purloin Boy.
Yep, the Purloin Boy, that's right. Anyway, Tom, tell us about yourself.
Tom Price, systematic theologian, Christian ethicist. I teach both at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and other places, teach philosophy, and this summer we'll be writing a book, a battle handbook for the baptized, if you will.
All right.
But really it's going to tie together theological, ethical, and apologetic interests into one volume, hopefully. May become two in the long run. But along the nature of the old handbooks, when people were baptized, they were actually catechized into the spiritual warfare, intellectually, spiritually, and sort of ethically that they were entering.
Yeah, get the Enchiridion.
That's right, similar to those, but dealing with the kind of distinct idols and gods we have to face today. Versus the earlier ones. So.
Right. Glenn.
My name is Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and at my current count, I've got 5 book projects I'm working on.
All right,
Excellent.
Glenn, way to go.
Excellent.
The prolific Glenn Sunshine.
Yeah.
I'm working on them. They're not out yet.
That's right. And we have back Christian with us. Christian, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, Christian Cuthbert. I'm a pastor here in the Vernon, Connecticut area. My true area of expertise is early American religious history, but one of my passions is Tolkien, Lewis, and all things Inklings.
That's right, and that's a great segue to the subject of the day. It's my day, and as folks who listen to this show know, we are on rotation, and each of us get to introduce the subject of the day, and today is my day, and we're going to be talking about Tolkien. And, in part, what I have to share today is the result of my research and my work on Tom Bombadil. And one of the things you learn if you take Bombadil seriously and you don't just think of him as sort of like some kind of, thing that Tolkien indulged in just kind of on the side and didn't have anything important in mind when he did so. And I think a lot of people assume that's the case with Bombadil. But if you take, Bombadil seriously, he's a subject who can lead you, traipsing along into all kinds of things. And in the course of my research for the book, I picked up one of the volumes in the History of Middle-earth. This is a series of volumes that has been published by Christopher Tolkien, drawing on the just enormous legendarium of his father, J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, when you get into Tolkien, I think many of us who get into Tolkien through the books, I know in my case, I got started with The Hobbit.
Yeah.
Right? You get into The Hobbit. And when you get into The Hobbit, you get into the shallows of the legendarium. You're waiting, and you think, man, the water's great. I'd like to go deeper. And you have a sense that it does go deeper, but you're basically, waiting. The water's up to your knees or up to your waist. And then you get into the Lord of the Rings. And then after you've gotten into the Lord of the Rings, you realize that now you're up to your neck. And every once in a while, there's something that happens or is said or referred to in the Lord of the Rings, and you find yourself sunk beneath the waves.
Yeah.
You just suddenly plunge down. You've stepped into a little ravine or a little hole in the floor of the ocean, and then you have to sort of struggle to get back to the surface again. But when you get into the Silmarillion, then you're completely underwater. You're just in this vast story that just goes in all directions. Hundreds of characters with odd names, which
and a
are
complete metaphysic.
Yeah, there's a metaphysic at work, and the names and the metaphysics the metaphysic is all vaguely familiar, but you don't know why.
That's right.
You say, I think I understand this, but why do I understand it?
And
why is that name so familiar?
The attraction and the repulsion, all that goes with a good, sound metaphysic.
Now, but when you finish the Silmarillion, you think, whew, I'm glad that's over with. Then you discover, no, posthumously, J.R. Tolkien is the most prolific author who has ever lived, or been dead.
He's still writing.
He's still writing.
They're still translating his works.
That's right.
Well, I might hold up L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah. But according to the Scientology, see, he actually may be still getting us information.
Yeah. I've often thought about writing a fantasy story in which there is an undead cleric by the name of L. Ron Hubbard.
So is he related to Elrond?
Yeah.
Definitely not. I grew up in Scientology, so listeners know. This is all kind of painfully familiar to me.
In a completely different metaphysic we're doing.
Oh, definitely. Anyway, so getting back to sanity, getting back to reality, getting back to J.R.R. Tolkien.
That's right.
And I'm speaking philosophically here. We're talking about philosophical realism here. So with Tolkien, we've got, when I read the things that Christopher, his son, says about these manuscripts that he's working through, I'm just astonished. The guy must never have thrown anything away. There just must be like rooms of paper.
I scribbled a note over there. Just make sure you keep it. Keep it.
Yeah, very important if you want to understand the origins of Elrod. This napkin at the restaurant with the stain. Anyway, so there's all this stuff going on. And, I'm like, how does he sort through it all? How does he work through it? Well, now with the history of Middle-earth, we've got, sort of the field notes, the stuff that Tolkien was working with. And we have version B and version C and version D and so forth. So we have kind of the canon, you could say, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, that's the canon. But now we have all of these, we've got essentially textual criticism going on here. We've got all of these, scribal errors. There actually are scribal errors. and contradictions and various trails.
But note they're not ascribable to a different author anyway. Okay.
No, they're all the same guy. It's the same guy. So we have all these things going on. And anyway, after the publication of the Lord of the Rings, and before the Silmarillion came out, and just so folks know, the Silmarillion was published posthumously. It was never complete to Tolkien's satisfaction, and it was only after he was dead that his son actually got it published. So it comes out, I think, in 1978, if I remember right.
Sounds about right.
And I remember reading it after it came out, because I had read The Lord of the Rings, as a teenager, and I was, breathlessly anticipating the publication of the Silmarillion. And then when I read it, I was like, what is this? The tone, the prose style, everything was so different. It was sort of high mythology.
Yeah, but I remember it. I came across it when I was living in Oxford, and I knew of it prior. I just hadn't had the time to get to it. And this was after rereading Lord of the Rings. Was a big hype at that time. But I remember being completely captivated, especially from the way in which the metaphysic and creation story just permeated with an aesthetic. The musical in particular. I remember reading it with some friends there, and we just all were, we were changed by it. It was that aesthetically beautiful and incredible.
Yep. Now, here's the marvelous thing about it. If you have any sort of background or facility with the history of the West, and the Western intellectual tradition, you can see that Tolkien's not making this stuff up out of thin air. He's working with things
Yep.
that he's inherited. He's incorporating them into his world and breathing new life into them.
Yeah.
So I know that you wanted to talk a little bit, Glenn, about the music of the Ainur. But in terms of the creation, this is kind of what we're referring to, the first chapters of the Silmarillion.
Yeah.
This is all important background for what I want to talk about, because what I want to talk about is the 10th volume in the history of Middle-earth, and the title of the book is Morgoth's Ring. Now that is something to reflect about or reflect on, and that, by the way, is Tolkien's term, Morgoth's Ring. But let's think a little bit about the music of the Ainur and what you wanted to say about that, Glenn.
Well, first of all, we have to
I'm all set.
know something about who Morgoth is.
You're welcome to hang
if
out.
you're not familiar with the
sorry.
mythology. Tolkien, I guess the best analogy that you can have is that Tolkien has God there, known as Eru or Iluvatar.
Right.
And under God, there are a bunch of spiritual beings that are known as either Valar, call them archangels, and Maiar, or angels. I mean, it's probably the easiest way of thinking about them. And the way Tolkien's creation story goes is that all of the Valar were singing together under Iluvatar, under Eru, under God. And it was beautiful, and there was wonderful harmony and all of that sort of thing. But one of them, named Melkor, who was one of the most powerful of them, started saying to himself basically, well, why do I have to do it this way? And he went off on his own and created discord.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And Eru smiled and just sort of raised his hand, and all the discord harmonized back in. It all resolved itself.
Kind of like jazz. So.
Kind of like jazz. And then...
It'd be interesting. It would be marvelous to get Tolkien's take on that comment.
I'm not entirely sure we really want to associate the creation of jazz with Melkor.
That's but the way in which it kind of found its way back into Resolve.
Right. But then Melkor wasn't happy with that, and so he insisted on going off on his own again, and he distracted a lot of the others and pulled them with him, and it was just ugly distortion and all that, at which point Eru stops it.
Yeah.
And looks at Melkor and says, all right, I'm going to show you what you just did. And that act of incarnating the music was the creation of Middle-earth.
Right. Now, there are
And I think that where he goes with Morgoth's Ring, that background is critical.
Oh, that's very much the case. So you have this, which you could say is this grand chorus, where you have these intelligences, the Valar, also known as the Ainur, who are contributing to the theme. In other words, they're not just picking up a score of music that's been given to them by Iluvatar.
That's right.
Although they're the offspring of his thought. So it's not as though Iluvatar is surprised at anything that is done. Nevertheless, they have real agency.
Okay.
They're not merely following scripts, and they're harmonizing with each other.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's a kind of participation in the music. Melkor introduces the disharmony. He draws many of the other Ainur to him, and one of the things that really comes through, though, is the way Iluvatar resolves the dissonance, the discord, is by the introduction of new themes. And the two new themes are the children of Iluvatar. One of those themes, the first theme, is the elves, or the Eldar, and the second is men, or the Edain, the followers. And it's men who succeed. It's that introduction of the theme of men that succeeds in bringing resolution and final consummation to the music.
Now, before you run, because there's a lot, there's a lot there, and I don't want to run by it, and I don't think we can address it properly, but here we have aesthetic, metaphysic, and narrative, and creativity, if you will, imagination. I mean, running into probably the most comprehensive exhibition of what you can pretty much do
Right.
with it. But you're creating, on the one hand, this notion of creation as singing forth. Let's say from our Christian theological tradition, we often talk about the word. But
Right.
then when we start to read the Psalms, we realize that creation's response itself is hymnic. It's voicing creation's praise is melodic and musical. And the way he weds those two together in his imagery, and that it creates, because you often see with music this very thing. I mean, these things come together in music in ways I think no other form does, and yet literary and musical come together for him. I don't know his interest in that, but I don't know enough about him to know his interest in that. But there's something going on there that I think is very rarely touched by most people.
Yeah, you've got the Pythagorean element, which is the musical.
Yeah.
In other words, the idea that there's
The harmony, the music, the
harmonies.
harmony, the mathematical.
But it doesn't seem to leave room for the will or the creativity of individuals as intelligences who contribute to a greater harmony.
Uh-huh.
This seems like you need to get with the program or you're dead.
Yeah.
That's Pythagoras.
So you have sort of the composer, you have the performer, but then you have the one that is actually improving
Yeah.
within that.
And by the way, I think this is one of the ways in which Leaf by Niggle kind of is actually another manifestation of this.
Yeah.
When we talk about Leaf by Niggle, the short story by Tolkien about the painter who can't finish the big tree that he wants to finish before he dies or goes on his great journey, and then he discovers at the end of his journey, in other words, in the next life, and in heaven or whatever, there's his tree.
Yeah.
And I think what's implied is that our works follow us. Our works follow us. When we think about the kings who bring their treasures, their glories, into the presence of the king as tribute, the great king. There's a sense in which our works follow us. And I know that, generally speaking in evangelical circles, when we think of our works following us, we're thinking about, soul winning, or we're thinking about giving food to the poor, or things like that. But we don't think about Mozart. We're not thinking about, our creative works.
Where Karl Barth would have been thinking about Mozart.
That's right. So
In terms of music, it's worth noting that the longest book in the Bible is a book of songs.
yeah, that's
The
right.
Psalms
right.
are songs. That's what the word means. And along with that, if you read carefully in the Old Testament, prophecy is most often done to music, it seems.
Yeah, there is a kind of
There is a
meter to
connection
it, yeah.
between, when Samuel tells
Oh, yeah,
Saul,
yeah.
you're going to run into a group of prophets coming down from the mountain, and they're going to be playing the flute and the psaltery and the lyre. I think that's probably why they call it a prophetic band. When you see that, that's the first example that I know of. But over and over again, you're going to find examples of prophecy to music.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a connection between music and the spiritual that I think we really tend to underestimate.
Yeah, I do think. I think it is there in Scripture, but because in Scripture it is not laid out in a, especially for people with redemptive history focus. It's not. It comes in here and here and here later down the pike. We don't associate it as bound up with word and creation.
Right.
Where
right.
I think this is where the move he makes, and I think there's something. I've always said that the musical element, the aesthetics you get with music, that is able to actually combine things in ways often other aspects of aesthetic don't. I think there is the visual, the icon. All these things are fine, but you have here something that is able to, I know this is popular language. Dramatically bring one up into it. Socrates' famous line. I think it was him who said that here's music is the one thing that causes every person to kind of drop its guard. I mean, and you're dealing with that. Why? Because there is something about it that, there's a transcendental connection of music. And I think the psalmists capture it, because what do psalmists do? They're talking about creation. They're talking about redemption. They're talking about war. They're talking about every aspect of our life, but they're doing it in song.
Yeah. Well, I have a more fundamental question. Like, Tolkien, in the introduction to Lord of the Rings, famously said that he abhors simple analogies, right? So, the Two Towers is not Mussolini and Hitler.
Right.
So he's not writing to reflect contemporary political or social movements, but it seems like Tolkien is drawing on this Western intellectual tradition, drawing on the Bible. Actually, in his letters, he self-consciously says when he rewrote The Lord of the Rings, he rewrote it as a Christian story.
Yeah, right.
To what extent do you think Tolkien would own some of these parallels between biblical themes of creation and such?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I go ahead, Jill. Go ahead. Yeah.
I read a while ago in a book about Tolkien, I think it was by Kilby, that someone had written an article in which he had said that the triplex munus Christi, the three offices of Christ, prophet, priest, and king, are embodied in The Lord of the Rings by its three principal characters. The prophet is Gandalf, the priest is Frodo, and the king is Aragorn. And when Tolkien was asked about it, he said, I wasn't thinking about that when I wrote it, but it is what I believe, and what I believe is inevitably going to come out in what I write.
Well, and as well, if a writer is writing about what's real will be reflected in what's written. So, one of the things I think that people who've never written fiction, there's a learning curve to writing fiction. When I first got into writing fiction, I wrote it kind of like John Bunyan. It was all kind of allegorical. Yeah. There was a very clear correspondence. This means that kind of thing, and it was just sort of like creating, puppets, who perform for you. But what you have when you write fiction in the best mode is something different. It's the characters have lives of their own, and you, as a writer, kind of discover who your characters are. And in the process of discovering who the characters are, you, as you write about them, say, oh, no, he would never do that, or she would never do that, or this is what she would do in this situation. You just kind of know. You have kind of an intuitive sense because the character's real to you. But what are you really in touch with there? Are you just in touch with figments of your imagination, or are you somehow getting in touch with something real in the largest sense? Yeah. I think that's what's going on. Because philosophically, I'm a realist. I believe in these things as being real things. And so if a particular character is somehow tapping into, sort of what, John Milbank calls the suspended middle, if the characters are tying into courage and truth and fidelity and these kind of things, you can kind of know, okay? And then of course, every character is a unique mix of things. So like when you talk about the three offices of Christ, I talk about that in my book on Bombadil. You've got, I think, it's not something contrived or forced. What you actually have is a sort of coming to the surface of realities that are present in our world, in the story, in these personages in the story. So it's not as though, Tolkien had to work it up. He's working with reality, and it's inevitable that reality will sort of raise its head.
Yeah. Well, reality is just as real on Earth as it is in Middle Earth.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I think all of that holds together. Now, what I'd like to do at this point is think a little bit about how this sort of works out. So anyone who's read the Silmarillion, or maybe just read The Lord of the Rings, there's a sense in which, there is a genuine sort of, I think, that, sort of vindication of the created order in the stories. You've got beauty, you've got harmonies, you've got just a world that is on display, mentally or sort of through imagery, that you just say, I just want to live there. I don't care if I don't have a cell phone. I want to live there.
Yeah.
What he's trying to do, though, I think, is he's trying to help us not just want to be there, but help us to be where we are and help us see things that are already true about our own world. But there's another element here to this. And Tolkien's reflections upon the influence of Melkor upon Middle-earth, upon Arda at large. Arda is sort of a larger sort of category within which Aman, which is the blessed realm, which is Valinor, and Middle-earth both exist, right? And you've got the Valar, who are the Ainur, who live in Valinor or Arda. And then you have Middle-earth, which is the middle place, really hearkening back to kind of Norse mythology and the ways, you think about Midgard and stuff like that. Anyway, so what about Melkor's dissonance, his disharmony? Just how does that work itself out? So you've got the song, and then Iluvatar says, and now the song is incarnate, and he shows the Ainur, the sort of the handiwork, so to speak, of their music, and says, there it is, the world. And then they enter into it. Not all of them, not all of the Ainur enter into it, but many of the Ainur enter into Arda, and they enter into it with different roles and different objectives and sort of different things that sort of things that they love, in that order, things that have to do with their own natures. You've got Manwë, who is the brother of Melkor, so to speak, who is nearly equal to him in strength, but not quite. Melkor is definitely kind of the Hulk Hogan or the Arnold Schwarzenegger of the Valar. I mean, he's just like the biggest, baddest thing around. And you wonder if he hadn't given himself over to pride, just what would he have accomplished, in a positive sense? But he doesn't. He gives himself over to his own pride, and in the course of the sort of the unfolding story of Middle-earth, in its earliest phases, you have this sort of battle going on of sort of primal elements. And Melkor is fire and ice, essentially. He's the volcanic, he's the ice age, he's that one. He's that Valar who introduces those things which bring to naught the work of the other Valar. He's continuously destroying what they create. And this goes on for a long time. Eventually, there's a kind of stasis, and enough stability is established so that life can emerge and the world can take its form. But then creatures are introduced, and finally, the children of Iluvatar enter into the world. First of all, the Eldar, the elves, and what you discover, in Tolkien's reflections upon this whole process, is that Melkor had those children in mind all along. He wanted to create for himself servants from them, and in the process, he is not simply an agent who is acting upon the world. Eventually, Melkor's power is disseminated into the material world. And in Morgoth's Ring, Tolkien's reflecting on how this occurs. So, if you remember in the Silmarillion, by the time the Silmarillion comes to its end, Melkor is almost a kind of pitiful figure. He's afraid he won't come out of Ulmo. He's relying upon the service of Balrogs and dragons and so forth to protect himself. He's even afraid, at different points to come out and fight. What happens? Well, according to Tolkien, what happened is that his power is disseminated, distributed throughout the entirety of Arda, not just simply among his servants, but into the very structure of reality. So he's diminished in the very act of trying to gain total mastery. That's the paradox. So let me read a passage here from these reflections or these sort of like apocryphal writings of Tolkien. So this is from the chapter entitled "Myths Transformed in Morgoth's Ring," and this is page 400, and this is how it goes. Thus, outside the blessed realm, all matter was likely to have a Melkor ingredient. And those who had bodies, nourished by the Hora of Arda, the Hora, it's spelled H-R-O-A, so however you say that, he's talking about physical bodies, were a tendency, small or great, towards Melkor. So if you had a body, you had a tendency toward Melkor. They were none of them wholly free of him in their incarnate form. And their bodies had an effect upon their spirits. But in this way, Morgoth lost or exchanged or transmuted the greater part of his original angelic powers of mind and spirit, while gaining a terrible grip upon the physical world. So this, sort of, when we think about Luther's hymn, that line that says, as far as the curse is found, am I getting that right? Yeah. The idea that the curse that has been introduced to the created order because of, Satan's work has affected not just simply the will, but even the bodies. Now, this is where people can kind of go...
That's Isaac Watts, by the way.
Oh, Isaac Watts, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yep. But this is where people can kind of, I think, go in a Gnostic direction.
That's right.
This is one of the ways in which Christians have traditionally got caught up in Gnosticism. By the way, Tolkien very explicitly, rejects that idea, even with regard to Arda and Middle Earth. Yeah. But what he's saying, though, is that even though creation is still good, we still have to deal with this Melkor element.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is important for a number of reasons. One of those reasons being that when we think about the children of Iluvatar, when we're introduced to the elves, not so much in The Hobbit. This is something that comes out in Lord of the Rings. The elves, have unending life, or at least appear to have unending life, right? What we learn in Morgoth's Ring and in other places in the history of Middle-earth is that's not the way the elves thought of themselves. The elves knew that they had an end, that they would end when the world ended. So why would the world end? Well, because of Melkor. There is a kind of terminus point. Yes, there was we're not just thinking about finitude in the sense that everything that has a beginning has an end, right? That's just kind of logical. What we're talking about is a kind of a spiritual thing that is more in the nature of a curse. There is a terminus point because the creation is under judgment because of this Melkor element that's been introduced to everything.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why I thought starting with the music of the Ainur would be important.
Oh, yeah.
Because the creation itself is infected by Melkor even before it is created functionally.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and the beauty, of course, of the music of the Ainur is we know that there's a happy ending because at the end, Iluvatar smiles and, so kind of gives a Dutch rub to Melkor. Ah, you're a little boy, it's pretty good, but you're not good enough for the old man. There's that kind of element to the way the song ends.
Now, I'm sure our musical guest John here is wondering how does that work its way out of the harmony and dissonance musically?
But that's actually one of the things that
right.
No one knows.
Yeah.
Not even the Valar, not even the Ainur know.
Yeah.
So they have a sense.
Because they never hear the end of the song.
That's right. They never hear the end.
Great.
And
Great.
So this is the background for a very interesting conversation that occurs that's alluded to, I think, kind of in, we have the legendarium, then we have the legend of the legendarium. If you go out on the internet, you'll hear references to this conversation.
Sure.
This conversation between an elf lord and a human woman. And it's the elf lord is Finrod, and the human woman is Andreth. And this
So
is
before we get there, just one quick note.
Sure.
For those of you who aren't familiar with the Silmarillion, it's important for you to realize that Sauron was an underling to Morgoth. If you only know the Lord of the Rings, or worse, only know the movies of the Lord of the Rings, you got to understand, Morgoth was Sauron's boss.
That's right.
And that should tell you something about the level of power that we're dealing with here with him.
Yeah. In fact, this is a fun thing I'm glad you brought that up, Glenn, because there's actually something here in Morgoth's Ring. It's on page 394, where Tolkien addresses this very thing. He tells us what Sauron was actually like before he was fallen. And what was Sauron like before he was fallen? If you were to think of an unfallen Sauron, what would come to mind? Any thoughts?
A micromanaging bureaucrat.
That's it. You read my post on Facebook. So he's a neat freak. He's a person who likes things to be harmonious and work in a coordinated way. So one of the things that I think is beautiful about Tolkien, but I think about Christian theology in general, is that what you see in Christian theology is every good thing can have a way to fall.
Yeah.
Fall away from grace. And in so doing, there's a kind of unique quality to the evil. In other words, there's an evil that only Glenn Sunshine can be responsible for.
That's right.
But there's another evil that only Tom Price and Chris Wiley Christian Culver.
And it has that strange tension of the good Glenn Sunshine can do what the bad Glenn only what the bad.
What's
Glenn
the evil
Sunshine
twin's
can do.
name? And what's the term?
Oh yeah, it's in Superman. What is it?
Well, it's a German thing. What is that name?
Doppelganger.
Doppelganger.
Yeah.
That's it. That's right. The doppelganger.
Yeah, they have that whole.
I just think of the cartoons with the angel and the demon on the shoulder.
That's right. Right. So this is a paragraph that's addressing the difference between Morgoth and Sauron. So he says here, Sauron was greater effectively in the second age than Morgoth at the end of the first. Why? Because though he was far smaller by natural stature, in other words, Sauron was far smaller than Morgoth or Melkor, he had not yet fallen so low. So in other words, the higher you are, the lower you fall. So Melkor could fall farther than Sauron because he was higher. Eventually, he also squandered his power of being in the endeavor to gain control of others. But he was not obliged to expend so much of himself. To gain domination over Arda, Morgoth had let most of his being pass into the physical constituents of the earth. Hence, all things that were born on earth and lived on and by it, beasts or plants or incarnate spirits, were liable to be stained by Morgoth. Morgoth, at the time of the War of the Jewels, meaning the Silmarils, had become permanently incarnate. For this reason, he was afraid and waged the war almost entirely by means of devices or of subordinates and dominated creatures. So he's sort of in the rear guard because he literally is afraid to be harmed, because he's not what he had been. One of the things that is really very evident in Tolkien's work is that domination is kind of at the heart, or sort of the essence of evil.
Yeah. And we kind of see that today,
That's right. And this is to be distinguished from dominion, which, by the way, to give away the sort of the heart of my book on Bombadil is what I'm getting at. Bombadil is genuine dominion, what it looks like. Sauron, Saruman, Melkor, that's domination, which is what dominion looks like when it's fallen. So with the word dominion today, most people think of people like, Hitler or Saruman. And that's why they can't think of dominion in the sense that God grants to Adam and Eve, take dominion. Because what Tolkien's doing with Bombadil is showing you what dominion looks like when it doesn't have this Melkor element. Which, by the way, I'll give another thing away from my book. Who can remember when Melkor entered the world? Bombadil.
Yeah.
He was there before
Interesting.
Bombadil, or before Melkor comes. So anyway, so he is an unfallen creature, unfallen dominion. Anyway, you heard it here first. So getting back to this, so referring to the domination of others, this is from page 399.
Hold on, before I forget, Chris, you have to write a book. Your next book has to be.
Not the next one.
Hold on, sorry. The one after the next. The one after the next has to be dealing with this issue in relationship to Michel Foucault.
Okay.
I think you would broaden your.
Well, actually, I'm dealing with Foucault a little bit.
Okay,
you
well,
know,
I think you could get a series out of this.
I think the
have to-
less you deal with Foucault, the better. To be honest,
But actually,
But we have to deal with it, unfortunately.
but there are so many things that Tolkien is doing, like Lewis. Remember,
Yeah.
I think, who was it that said everything that Lewis wrote contained everything that Lewis thought? Basically the same thing is true with Tolkien.
It's true, yeah.
You think he's just writing about some character with yellow boots and a blue jacket, when in fact he's talking about sort of his theory of language.
Yeah.
And how it works, as opposed to Foucault and
Their whole
post-
spiritual, intellectual vision
Right,
is in
right.
everything they do. Yeah.
So this is page 399 from Morgoth's Ring. It is thus that a temptation to minds of greater power to govern or constrain the will of other and weaker minds, so as to induce or force them to reveal themselves. But to force such a revelation, or to induce it by any lying or deception, even for supposedly, quote, good purposes, end of quote, including the good of the person so persuaded or dominated, that's dealing with our leftist friends, is absolutely forbidden. To do so is a crime, and the good in the purposes of those who commit this crime swiftly becomes corrupted. That's Saruman. That's the story of Saruman in Middle-earth.
Well, and that's something we've talked about before when we were dealing with questions of enchantment many, many episodes ago.
Right.
One of the core rules, kind of across the board, that distinguishes white and black magic, even in
Right.
cultures that accept the distinction, is anything that takes away another person's will is automatically black magic.
Right,
And that
right.
is almost a universal.
And one of the things you see in Lord of the Rings is all of the truly good and noble, powerful characters, Gandalf, Galadriel, Elrod, Aragorn, they always honor the wishes of the lesser person. Frodo, be it Frodo or Bilbo or Pippin or Merry or what have you. There's always a kind of deference to the choice of the other.
It's what philosophers often call the premising of the will. I mean, that's what you have there. You have something that giving shape to the will to actually endow it to be the kind of free thing it's meant to be, versus, the destructive tendency of a will that isn't premised by these same things, that doesn't have these limits, these ends, these orientations. And so what you have, this will that rips itself from any obligation and therefore becomes an end in of itself, becomes so destructive and demonic.
And I think we see that, in a lot of places we wish we wouldn't see it.
Yeah.
We see it in mega churches.
Yes.
We see it in conservative political movements.
All the talk of empowerment, sadly, it's
And all
nothing
that.
more than a disgusting display of a will ripped out of premise. And what I mean by premise is larger purposes that are ordained
it's
for
often
a good.
deceptive.
Yes.
It's often a way of sort of drawing people into something that they think is going to benefit them, but in the end makes them
It
a
makes
tool.
them feel they're free.
Makes them feel they're free,
If you
but
will
they
only
be-
eat this fruit, you
That's
will.
right. And they become a tool, a fool and a tool
Yeah.
of the person who deceives them.
Yeah.
So anyway, now getting back to this conversation between the elf lord and the human woman, it's a fascinating one. So Finrod and Andreth are the characters. So let me read Tolkien's description of each of them. So Finrod, son of Finarfin, son of Finwë, was the wisest of the exiled Noldor. Now the Noldor, of course, are the elves that had been to Valinor, had seen the light of the trees, had been in the presence of Manwë and the other Valar. but had been led by Fëanor on a quest for the Silmarils that had been stolen by Melkor, right? So when the trees were destroyed, when they were killed, Melkor absconds, with the Silmarils and goes back to his kingdom in the north, and the Noldor go into exile pursuing him. And in the process of going into exile, they commit, fratricide. They kill their brothers. They kill other elves in the process to steal ships and so forth. So they've got blood on their hands. So they're now prohibited from returning to Valinor by the Valar. But Finrod is one of these noble princes, and it goes on to say, being more concerned than all others with matters of thought rather than with the making or with skill of hand. Now the Noldor were the elves who were the most gifted in craftsmanship, and that's why they made friends so readily with the dwarves and certain kinds of craftsmen among men. There was a kind of kindred spirit there. Elule, or Lue. Ole, yes, that's the name. He's the Valar, who's the sort of the kind
Smith.
of the, kind of the Smith, kind of the Hephaestus of the in this mythology. But anyway, or Vulcan, and he was more eager, moreover, to discover all that he could concerning mankind. So he's an ethnographer. He's out doing field research. He's an anthropologist, literally studying men. And so he's one of the first of the Eldar to meet the men coming into the west, and Beleriand, and then Andreth was a woman of the house of Beor, the sister of Bregor, father of Barahur, whose son was Baron One Hand of renown. Now, Baron One Hand, of course, is the consort of Luthien, and eventually they end up managing to steal one of the Silmarils back. And when you read the Silmarillion and you hear the story of Baron, he's an impressive fellow.
Yeah.
He wasn't just sort of somebody that she had sympathy for as he was lost in the woods. I mean, he's a monster of a guy.
He wasn't your classic loner.
No. The leap of Baron. It was renowned among elves and men. that kind of thing. So anyway, so she had learned the lore of men and their histories. And for this reason, the Eldar called her Seifind, or wise heart. Yeah. So she's a wise woman among men. So she's a lore master, or a lore mistress among her people. And so he befriends her to learn about men. What's their story? What's in the background? What he discovers, what Finrod discovers, is men don't want to talk about the past. There's a shadow that is upon them. Now, so they don't want to look back. They're longing for the light, and that's the reason why they've gone, west. Is they've been told by the Dark Elves that that's where the light is coming from. So they're going in the direction of Valinor, and there's obviously something that happens with men that is unusual from the perspective of elves. I mean, these are fellow children of Iluvatar, so they expect the men to arrive. So the Eldar know that there's another race coming after them, the Edain, and they know that they are equally children of Iluvatar, so they have no reason to sort of be condescending or proud. They're from the same source. But then they discover that men die. And they're, what's with this?
and what's wrong with these people?
That's right. And so, they term them the sickly. Bjorn the Old eventually dies. And so the elves are puzzled by it. The men, there's a kind of embarrassment that the men seem to have about it. And that it's the elves who surmise that this must be some kind of mysterious gift from Iluvatar. Because what the elves discern in mankind is a kind of unrest, a kind of longing for something that they can't find in Middle Earth. And so they term men the guests. So they think of men as just kind of passing through, that this is not their natural home.
Yeah, this is where you're sort of, theologically speaking, we talk about pilgrim man, the wayfarer, and it's in the song.
Yeah, right.
But there is that kind of that interesting way in which you're reversing classical notions of immortality.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And it's almost a strange kind of attraction for them that here is a group of people that should probably be the ones to be immortal, if anyone is to be immortal, and here they do. They have this limit placed on them.
Right. Well, and it's just as much a puzzlement to the men. They're not sure what to make of it too.
I don't know what to make of it.
That's right. But the theory that this is a gift from Iluvatar is actually from the elves.
Interesting.
So they're trying to convince men that this is actually in the design, that this is something that men should embrace and actually celebrate. So here's a snippet from the conversation. This is Finrod, and he says, I would rather believe that such a fae meaning spirit, of its own nature would at some time of its own will have abandoned the house of its sojourn here. In other words, the body. And we see that with Aragorn. Remember, at the end of the Lord of the Rings, Aragorn, in the appendix, I believe it is, voluntarily lays his life down and departs from his body. Actually, Arwen is appalled at the idea. The elf woman, finally understands, what, sort of doom has been laid upon men, and she says at that point, I used to think the men were fools. Now I finally understand, what you guys have been living with. So, but Aragorn nobly departs in the way Finrod describes here. But let me get back to this quote. Even though the sojourn might have been longer than is now permitted, then death would, as I said, have sounded otherwise to you, as a release or return, nay, as going home. But this you do not believe, it seems. And then Andreth says, nay, I do not believe this. So she knows something. And so what comes out over the course of the conversation is this visitation by Melkor early on in the story of men. And there's the competing voices. There's the voice of Iluvatar, which speaks inwardly to men and tells them what they're to do, and they reject that voice and believe Melkor. This is starting to sound like a little bit like, the Garden of Eden here, and there's a reason for that. But anyway, now, one of the things that comes out in the conversation, this is another fascinating thing, is Andreth, sort of another important part of the story between Andreth and Finrod, is Andreth is in love with Finrod's brother. Finrod is an elfin lord, of course. Finrod's brother loves her in return. There's
nothing like being an elfin lord.
Well, but there is a problem when you fall in love with a woman. Of men, she dies. She grows old and she passes away, and that's the nature of the problem. So Finrod's brother throws his own life away in the war against Melkor because he lives in despair, because he genuinely loves Andreth. Andreth, at this point in the story, is an old woman, and she's talking to Finrod. And this is sort of comes out in her conversation with her. There's a kind of the tincture of bitterness in everything she says, and Finrod is wise enough to know why. He says, it's because of your love for my brother. And then he reveals something to her that you don't get anywhere else in the Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion, and that is the elves also know that they will die. That it's not merely happenstance or what have you. They know that they will pass away when the world passes away. So they have a terminus point, just like men do. And this is news to Andreth. Andreth has never considered this possibility, that even if men had lived as long as elves, they would also just be looking forward to this point, this inevitable departure. So the question is, what are the roles
Yeah.
of elves and men in this whole story.
Well, what you see is this flood of realism, and as a Christian, I see it all over the place in it. But oftentimes, I don't think it theologically. We often have it so imaginatively descriptive, and I think what you have going on here is not romanticism in relationships, but real love, real attraction. But real recognition of both the tragedy, the limits, but also the beauty that is a result of those kind of drawing of parameters. And he's very attuned to that. I mean, he's very attuned to the details of things like limits, bounds, boundaries. This person may be able to live here, but they see what happens when trying to love with this kind of enduring love to somebody who can only have a temporal exhibition of it.
Right.
I mean, you have something that is, in many ways, takes all the riches of the romantic tradition, but none of the idealism of it.
Yeah, right,
And pours it right into the thick web of what real life and living is when you have these parameters drawn on you. And yet, how you recognize gift, grace, beauty, and yet the kind of sad face that sin and the fall have brought into everything, the limit. Right.
Yep.
The limit is a grace, but the limit is also something that doesn't allow eternality out of the wrong thing.
Right.
Well, it sounds like Tolkien is using Middle Earth to wrestle with a very earthly problem.
Yeah.
This idea that this world is not the way it was supposed to be.
Right.
And we have to, we lose parents and family and friends, and even in Middle Earth, they have to come to the realization that this is not the way it was supposed to be. I'm not really sure what Tolkien's answer to that might be, though.
Well, he actually does get to it.
Okay.
And it's a surprise, a very Christian solution. So
One thing is worth noting, though. When you die, you pass into something called the halls of waiting.
right.
And the halls of waiting are different for men and elves.
That's right.
So at least while the world lasts, there is no reconciliation between elves and men.
Right.
And no one knows what happens after that.
Yeah, but they do have hopes, and that's one of the things that introduces kind of the denouement, the resolution here. So Finrod proposes to Andreth that the role of men is redemptive, that actually that elves are dependent upon men in some important way to bring about the enlargement of the music. So here's what he says: "This then I propose was the errand of men, not the followers, but the heirs, the fulfillers of all, to heal the marring of Arda, already foreshadowed before their devising, and to do more as agents of the magnificence of Eru, to enlarge the music and surpass the vision of the world." And that's,
and it reminds you of, I guess, it's, Romans and other places where you talk about the whole creation growing until the children of men come into their their rightful eternal place.
So what he's saying is that the elves are under a curse as well. They're fading, bodily fading away. Their spirits can no longer be housed adequately. You see this at certain points, even in Lord of the Rings. Remember the flight to the Ford. Who's the elfin lord who is
Glorfindel.
Glorfindel, yeah. So Glorfindel unveils himself there, and there's this sort of theophany almost, this kind of manifestation of his glory. What's going on there is he's actually showing his inner fire, his spirit, that is only, I think, inadequately housed now because he's lived so long.
Yeah.
It's what you see in Glorfindel is also present in every child of Eru. It's just better kept or shrouded.
Another place is after the Mirror of Galadriel. I will fade and go into the west.
Yes, that's right. So there's this sense in which, now the term that the elves use is Estelle. That's their word for hope. And they have a hope there's this this hope that they have to hold on to, which men thought they were the only ones that were required to hold on to. Because, again, getting back to this whole idea that there's a terminus point for elves as well as for men, the elves have to live in hope just as men have to live in hope. And then there's the kind of the reveal at the end of the dialogue, and this is the reveal. And this is from Andreth. They say, answered Andreth, they say that the One, meaning Iluvatar, will himself enter into Arda and heal men and all the marring from the beginning to the end. This they say also, or they feign, is a rumor that has come down through the years uncounted, even from the days of our undoing. So there's a kind of proto-evangelium here that has been, even though Andreth has a hard time believing it because she's in despair, there's something that men know that the elves don't know.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like an echo of Revelation 21, and now the dwelling of God is with men.
Right.
And they will
right.
be his people, and he will be their God.
Right, right. And the healing, and I also think there's an incarnational element here. He will enter himself into Arda. I think what comes to my mind anyway when I hear Andreth say that is Christ's incarnation coming, the one coming into Arda. But anyway, some really rich stuff.
Yeah. I've been racking my brain about this for a little bit. Tolkien wrote the essay on fairy stories, right? And he says in On Fairy Stories that the fairy stories fulfill like the 5 basic needs of. I can only remember one of them, and it's the dumbest one, like being able to talk with animals. Which, I've never...
Look, I do that all the time.
I've never really felt the urge to
cats.
talk with animals, but I think there was one thing in there where he talked about like coming to terms with mortality or immortality. Do you guys remember?
Consolation is one of the things that he talks about. He talks about consolation. He also talks about evangelium. He talks about the sudden turn. Eucatastrophe.
Yeah.
So the sudden turn, we see that, of course, in the story of Frodo, beyond hope. I mean, even at the very end, he fails. He's laughing. He's put on the ring. He's maniacal. He's a mini, Dark Lord at that point. And then, Gollum fulfills his purpose and bites the ring off his finger. The pity of Bilbo.
Someday rule the fates of men. Yeah.
That's right. So all that stuff is marvelously, brought together. And I'm sure Tolkien would say that he's subcreating, but he's subcreating in sort of he's mimicking the larger story of the true eucatastrophe, which is the gospel, the evangelium, right?
Well, it gets back to this idea of not the way it's supposed to be. Like, are we in fact better off because of the fall?
Yeah,
the idea of having access to union with Christ that Adam didn't have, and so many other things.
Yeah. And that's, one of the things you get. I always joke with our audience, but I often talk about Tolkien as sort of is imaginative commentary on Scripture. I really think that's what he's up to, and I think he would admit that's what he's up to.
Yeah.
And incarnation was so central. He's the one who convinced Lewis on their little motorcycle ride through the Shire on a late Sunday afternoon. But that was the kind of. I think he was aware of that, and you can't escape it when you think about his way of dealing with the issue of evil in his stories and things like that. His metaphysical and theological understanding are phenomenal. I don't even think. I deal with theologians who deal with it right on the on the immediate sense of trying to articulate it in the most straightforward language. But when you see someone do it with imaginative language like Tolkien, there are. I understand. He would probably admit, of course, there are things going on there he had no idea he was saying that communicate. Every good writer would, right?
Right.
Our whole point is being caught up in something that transcends us, right? I hope when they talk about the author's meaning, they don't only mean the author's meaning. I do think there's this sense in which you're participating in this transcendent vision. But I think with him, his way of understanding the depths of that theological and metaphysical vision in such a way that he could create.
We're almost done.
He could create characters agents, story, narrative, a whole comprehensive vision, a whole language around that. We talked about Edwards in the last show.
Well,
it's another rare gem. I mean,
Yeah, language and geography. The scope of Tolkien's vision of the world is about as comprehensive as a human can get.
Yeah.
Where I would go with this is look at the alternatives, the high fantasy since Tolkien. You know, what are you going to get? Game of Thrones?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's
I mean,
right.
endless riding of the horse with the hair.
Or that one that I'm forgetting the Dark Matter, this dark.
His Dark Materials, Phil
Dark
Pullman.
Materials, Pullman series. I mean, these are the people who are self-consciously turning away from the vision of the good that Tolkien has.
Yes.
There are Melkors.
And
Melkors in miniature.
And the fact is, they create worlds that are ugly.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
And the exhibition of the base. I mean, that's really where they go with it. Where that's what I mean. Is here's someone who, I mean, that's another whole nother element. I mean, the way in which Tolkien can take the barbarity of history, the fall, sin, and yet not have it reduced to that.
And he's a guy that had personal experience with it. He lost parents early in life. He was a combatant in World War I.
And lost close friends there.
Lost close friends. So this is not, again, an academic exercise for him. He's reflecting upon his real losses and his real joys. Yeah. Anyway, we've gone a little long, so we should probably wrap it up. But we really do appreciate your support of the Theology Pugcast. And we don't say this very often, but it is appreciated if you give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast platform. That helps, or whatever, they have on your favorite platform, if it's stars or scrolls, I don't know. But also, we are very grateful for those who give on a monthly basis to the show. And the number of folks who do that grows weekly. And we're astonished. We get the report, and we're like, what? Again? Someone thinks that this is worth giving money to? Yeah. We use those funds to help, defray the cost of the show. We have production costs, and we're glad that folks help us to address those or take care of those.
And just to be clear, the production costs do not include the price of beer.
That's still on our own tab.
Right. That's right.
And mine is increasing weekly. A quick another note before Glenn retorts. We have a lot of ideas too. So when you do fund things, it's not merely just going to productive costs, but we are imaginatively thinking of fresh ways to widen what we do and broaden it, and really take the ideas and interests that we have, that you all have shown interest in, and develop those for something I think more accessible to everyone, and maybe something everybody can take advantage of. Yeah, we had a major gift recently that's going to underwrite 2 major projects, and eventually, when COVID is finally behind us, a Pugcast Roadshow. And maybe there'll be a little video supplement. That'd be great. That'd be great. Anyway, it was great to have you with us on the show today, Chris. Thanks for joining us. Great to be here. Yeah, I think Glenn had one more line.
Well, I was debating about a comment about Antiques Roadshow, but I don't think we'll go there.
We are the living antiques. Well, thanks again for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.